Good morning. My name is Julie Rosenberg and I am the Executive Officer at AIDN, the Australian International Development Network. AIDN's message is simple: more and better giving and investing from Australia to international development. One of the ways we go about doing this is by showcasing and amplifying the work, the amazing work that's already going on in the sector. This is our first webinar for 2021, so welcome, and it celebrates International Women's Day. We are co-hosting with ActionAid, and you'll hear from their Vice Chair and sector expert, the extraordinary and wonderful Belinda Morrissey, at the end of today's webinar. There are two themes for the day: women in leadership and choosing to challenge. Both inextricably, in my mind anyway, linked. Both come back to the same goal of achieving an equal future for women, parity and inclusivity. We are privileged today to be listening to the stories of four amazing leaders, all who also happen to be women. We will hear their stories of past and future challenges and choices, and you'll get a chance to question them. We will have both a chat and Q&A functions operating today, so get typing. Let's hear from you. Sharon Bhagwan Rolls from Fiji, Sam Mostyn and Tara Winkler in Sydney will be in our discussion today with Kristina Stefanova, presently in Melbourne. Kristina has traversed the globe, spanning both public and private sectors, and has managed to build not one, but two businesses in the climate space. She's worked for USAID and World Bank. She is a journalist, philanthropist, board director that is intent on making a difference. She is acutely focused on the need for action now. Kristina will be the first to say that weaving her interests and immense talents together to be a cohesive force for good has been a challenge. But interestingly enough, she says that challenge has been assisted by philanthropy. Kristina will introduce you to our seriously awesome panel, and I am so looking forward to listening to them. But before we get underway, let me, on behalf of everybody involved from wherever you are tuning in and joining us, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on and pay our respects to them and leaders past, present and emerging. We'd also like to take the opportunity to thank them for their continued care of our land, sea and community. Over to you, Kristina.
Thank you, Julie, and welcome everyone. Very glad to be here today. And as Julie said, what an amazing panel of women we have to challenge and also celebrate a day yesterday, International Women's Day. So belated Happy Women's Day to everyone. And what an important time to be talking about the things that we're talking about today and to be celebrating women. Certainly the last few years have been particularly challenging for women around the globe, and no less so in Australia at the moment with everything that's going on in Canberra. We were just having a conversation about how for many women, especially younger women, the conversations at the moment are just taking us back in time, and how much, as much as we move forward, we actually move back, and how many issues there still are and challenges to work through, especially for women. Everyone here today on this panel will talk from their own perspective about that, but I think we all share in this sense of exactly as Julie said, now more than ever needing to talk and to stand up for each other and for other women, and to really encourage women leadership, because we're certainly seeing the failures across the globe when that is missing. And equally, as we have some incredible leaders out there today, especially on the global scene, we see what a difference it makes when we have a female in power who uses that power in a different way and really shifts the power for the entire communities and for other women around her to the benefit of entire communities. So a lot to unpack in that brief statement there, but very much wanted to acknowledge that certainly it's been challenging times, and in Australia, especially younger women are certainly just looking at what's going on in the news at the moment and just probably not quite sure what to make of it. And it's definitely not positive, whatever it is. So we certainly want to encourage you. This conversation is about saying, yes, you can do it. Yes, now is the time to come in and do it. And all of the women on this call, I think, have gone through a very broad journey of pulling things together to find a space where they can make the most difference. and have the largest impact for their communities. So I think I'll leave it at that and really just introduce our speakers and start with some questions. And then we certainly want to have some time with the audience at the end and take individual questions. So just a very quick introduction of everyone. Sam is a businesswoman and a sustainability advisor with a very long history of executive and governance roles across business, sport, climate change, arts, policy, nonprofit sectors. Earlier this year, as some of you probably know, she was awarded the AO for Distinguished Service to Business and Sustainability and to the broader community. Sam is the chair of the Australian Investing in Women at the moment, and she'll be able to talk across all of those topics. Tara is the co-founder of the Cambodian Children's Trust. She set this up in 2017 to help 14 children escape an abusive orphanage and has gone through an incredible journey since then. Over the last 14 years, she has changed the Cambodian Children's Trust through a number of significant organizational shifts, including a significant transition from orphanage model to a family welfare model, excuse me. She has testified at the Australian Parliament Inquiry into Modern Slavery. She's written and published a book, and she's making a film about it. So thank you, Tara, for being with us today. Sharon is a second-generation Fiji Island feminist working on the intersection of gender, media, communications, and peace. She's a technical advisor for the Shifting the Power Coalition, which supports Pacific women in disaster, in responding to disaster and climate change and encouraging female leadership. Following a career in broadcast, Sharon also co-founded and engineered the Women's Weather Watch, a program that supports women to lead climate response during disaster and through communications platforms. So very wide remit of experience here. And we really like to hear more organically for everyone about their journeys. So I'll just throw some larger questions at you. And we can, I think, just have the conversation more generally. And those are really, because we're celebrating women and our successes at the moment, what are the challenges or the system change that you three have been most proud of? And how have you gone about that? How have you overcome that challenge? And why did you choose to challenge? Why was that the challenge you chose in the first place? Who would like to get us going on that? Sharon. Hi, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And it's just great to come together across the Pacific Ocean with sisters in Australia as well. And I think that's, for me, first and foremost, an important message for our work together across the Pacific as members of the Pacific Islands Forum. You know, for me, at a very personal level, and around about 1999, I started to question where I was in the media. And so in 2000, I actually stepped out of that comfort zone of commercial corporate media and worked together with a diverse group of women. We had actually come together challenging quite peacefully the political crisis in our country of that year. And what resulted was we found a collective vision and we established FemLink Pacific by September that year. And we worked together over time with women who for a very long time had been silenced, had not had access to media spaces that they really should have been, or even seeing themselves in the media. What resulted was our opportunity to link with other Pacific Island women, to engage with different government departments, even though there is still this notion that if we're talking about gender equality and women's rights, then it must only be about the Department of Women. And we were able to create spaces such as the co-creation of Women's Weather Watch to challenge the status quo. And as part of that collaboration and feminist organizing, the next challenge was in collaboration with ActionAid in 2016, while I was still at FemLink, when we decided to create the Shifting the Power Coalition. It was really important because we had experienced, you know, another set of massive cyclones in Vanuatu in 2015, in Fiji in 2016. And we knew that Pacific women are leading, Pacific women are organizing, but we're just not in the right spaces. And so we needed to respond to the humanitarian crisis and this notion that we are simply vulnerable. So we got together and said, we're not going to get shut out anymore. We need to have access to the resources. We need to have our priorities front and center in the NGO community, and not being spoken about, particularly by international INGOs. So that feminist collaboration, again, was that opportunity to choose to challenge in a space 5 years ago, where we brought together 13 women-led organizations from 6 specific countries to say, we need to challenge the status quo, we need to challenge male domination, and we also need to challenge the fact that international INGOs were only seen to be the ones with the answers for us. Since then, we've been able to resource local women's leadership, whether it's been through in response to local or national disasters, in response to COVID-19, and we've been able to show that women, Pacific Island women, have the knowledge. We're able to share across the coalition. We're creating a new space of collaboration as well, and we're able to then collectively drive a gender-responsive humanitarian action in a way that people are stepping back and looking now and saying, yes, we need to listen to these women in the communities. We need to acknowledge that these are the women leaders. And for me, to be able to amplify that in different spaces, including at the United Nations, where we've been able to influence the need to have a Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action Compact as part of the Generation Equality Forum. So for me, that's been, I guess, a series of changes, because I don't think it's just the one, but for me, what is really important is the fact that when you have that feminist solidarity and collaboration, sometimes in your own community or across, the Pacific Ocean, we are certainly able to make that change. Thanks, Kristina.
Thanks, Sharon. And I did say I'll throw both questions out, and I realized that I didn't, but maybe I'll follow up while you're speaking just to close that loop, because I suspect that you will repeat some of those things, and rightly so, which is to say, what do you see as the next big challenge and the next big change that needs to occur? And I know you've recently become a grandmother, you have a little grandson, and certainly these sorts of things make us think even more about the future and about change. I mean, what are you thinking about at the moment that is the next big hurdle there?
Intergenerational feminist learning is certainly something front and center of my mind. As always, I've had the opportunity, and I've just been so lucky to have had strong women from my great-grandmothers to my own grandmothers and my mother. And of course, my daughter, who is a very strong young feminist as well. But as I have become a grandmother, and I, certainly women's health and children's health is clearly a critical issue. But something that connects us all across the Pacific is, what COVID-19 came on top of the climate change crisis for our region. And that's something that we have seen intersecting with the health pandemic. When we've asked women, how has COVID-19 impacted you? It's come right back to some of those basic issues around access to health, access to resourcing, the huge economic impact that's creating an additional burden already on women's unpaid care work, that creates greater vulnerability of the girl child, of young women. Unfortunately, hearing that in my own country, when I've spoken to sex workers, that the age of sex workers is getting younger because young girls are in that vulnerable place as well. And so, it's impacting on economies that have been so reliant on tourism. So I think what's really important is a couple of things. We need to get stronger as the women's movement in our countries to be able to take these messages, like I said, not just to the departments of women, but into the other governmental spaces. And we need to use these intergovernmental spaces, such as the Pacific Islands Forum, where Australia is a member, to also hold governments like Australia accountable to issues around the reduction of carbon emissions. And at the same time, making sure that there is the investment around climate change funding, but that it's designated also for women and the women's rights work, the feminist approach. Because I know we talk about women's leadership, and quite often it's very easy to simply quantify it by talking about elected women. But in our context, we're talking about women in traditional governance, in community leadership, in faith communities. So I'd like to be able to see that change where we're recognizing women's leadership within civil society as well. And then the intergenerational movement of supporting women's leadership, so that as an older woman steps into a position, there is a young woman ready, if not also joining her in that position. So that's why we're working to support young women. And also my final point, if I could just wear my Global Fund for Women co-chair hat, is to say that's where the feminist funding is so important, because it's the feminist women's funds that have created those spaces of resourcing that can be catalytic, that can be innovative, and have the true value of feminist partnership, which is what we're going to need going forward. Thanks, Kristina.
Thanks, Sharon. And just to follow up on that, it was interesting that you mentioned, obviously, we've all been challenged by a year of COVID now, and what a layer that has added to existing challenges. There's been a lot of negatives, of course, but certainly I just wanted to briefly mention that sometimes there's successes in this space too. I chair the ARISE Fund within ActionAid, which you've been involved with over time as well. And that fund looks at empowering women. So we know that in some countries, climate disasters are reoccurrent and female leadership is lacking. And that by empowering women in advance, not just reacting when the disaster happens, that women are better able to take care of their communities, and the impact across the board is certainly greater. And one of the stories that I wanted to mention in terms of COVID is that the Women's Weather Watch, which Sharon has also been involved in, this message system, which was allowing women to find out about weather patterns and about climate and better being able to prepare in that sense. When COVID hit, for instance, in Vanuatu, the women were actually being able to send these messages across really remote communities, and they were certainly shifting something that they had learned through the climate area into something that was actually suddenly able to have huge impacts in the health space. So that got a lot of notice, not just because it enabled the communities to actually know what's going on, but again, Julie framed this from a conversation about philanthropy, and my own journey has been very much about how to use philanthropy on top of some of these areas to make the greater change. And that to me was such an example of, this is why you empower women. You've given them a tool in a particular context, but they're now able to take it and run with it in all of these other areas where they know what to do once they're enabled, and they can respond to challenges in their communities very quickly. So that ability to use that system for COVID was incredibly helpful in Vanuatu, and it was just a great story of how empowering women in one context can actually really lead to a greater community benefit. So thank you, Sharon. And Tara, would you like to maybe we'll go from the kind of intergovernmental system to maybe looking a little bit more at a specific context with the grassroots and in Cambodia and what you've been dealing with. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. In terms of the question of what I'm proudest of, this tends to be a question that makes me a little bit uncomfortable for a couple of reasons. One is that, like a lot of women in leadership and things, I struggle with imposter syndrome, and something I'm working on. But the other is that I think it's also a question that tends to kind of feed right into that white savior narrative and sort of makes out that I'm some kind of hero of saving Cambodian children. But I've been really heartened recently by the conversation I think is happening throughout the sector on the real need to decolonize international development. And while there's a lot of really good discussion happening, I think there's not so many examples of putting that discussion into action. So if I have to talk about something that I'm proud of, it probably would be one of CCT's lesser known projects, which was a ICT education project that we started several years ago. And that began because a lot of the youth that we were working with, we noticed that they were finishing high school and with no computer literacy skills whatsoever. So we partnered with Grok Learning, who are the writers of the Australian ICT curriculum here. And we partnered with all of the high schools in the city of Battambang to co-create an ICT education curriculum for the city. And because of how we designed that program, we did it in collaboration with the schools. Instead of sort of setting up our own privately run, NGO run IT school, we did it with the schools and embedded it into the public school curriculum. And the program over a couple of years was an enormous success. We had every single high school in Battambang running a course that took kids from, basic typing and computer hardware and, learning how to use Google Docs all the way through to programming and robotics. We had kids winning the national STEM competition, graduating and going off to study computer science. It was thousands of students were going through the course every year, but we were spending about $250,000 a year on running this program. We also put it into the teacher training college, so the new teachers that were coming up were learning how to deliver the course and things. And then it was being funded by one corporate IT donor. It was a sort of competition, and we didn't get through to the following round of funding 2.5 years into the project. So unfortunately, we were faced with a situation in which we just lost all of the funding overnight. And because it was sort of mission drift for us, in that it's, our core focus is child and family welfare and not IT education, we just made the hard decision to not seek further funding for it. And we fully expected that the project would end at that point. And I think, IT projects like this are notorious for sort of being unsustainable. And so we unfortunately, had to let go of all the staff that, from our organization that were working on the project and things, and expected, it all to fall into disrepair and the computers to become sort of graveyards of derelict, unused computers. But that's not what happened. And now 4 years on, so longer than the project was actually funded, it's operating as it was. And that's because the schools had all of the knowledge and wherewithal to run the program. They saw the value in it, and they made the decision to continue it on themselves, and they do their own fundraising to generate the costs to sustain that project. And it's actually been growing. Teachers that have been coming out of the teacher training college have been taking it into their schools, increasing enrollments into the course, senior school students electing to take the course. So it's a real example of sustainability, which I think is sort of a rare thing in international development, of a project that can live on and outside of the implementing NGO. And that's all the learnings that we took from that sort of accidental success. Like we didn't intend to lose the funding, and we didn't, but all of the lessons that we learned from how we designed that program in collaboration with the schools, and not running things in parallel to public systems, but embedding it into the community where it was in the hands of the community. That is the learnings that we're taking now into everything that we're doing in terms of this big shift in power, away from things that are just solely NGO run and controlled, and putting the control into the hands of the community. So yeah, I'd say that would be one of the things that
That's fantastic. And again, a parallel there of enabling the local community to make some of the decisions and be the driver of change.
Yeah.
And what do you see as the challenge or the next hurdle from here?
So for our organization, the next challenge is our village hive model, which is a community-led holistic child protection system, which is designed by the community and makes communities really resilient, particularly in times like COVID, by bringing holistic services into the community that is often targeted and empowering women heads of households, to be able to have all of the resources and support they need to raise their own children, and support their own families. So that various components of that and services that are part of that model, we were running as an NGO in private spaces that we rented and staffed and things. So we're now in the process of handing that over community by community, so our youth centre program, which ensures that the most vulnerable children in any community are able to access their basic needs while their parents are working towards some of the longer term financial goals and setting up small businesses and savings plans and things, that while those social workers are working with the families towards those longer term goals, that children are able to access nutrition and healthcare and education. So we used to run them out of privately run centres, but now those centres, we're transitioning them so that they're all embedded into the public schools, and it is co-managed by the local council, and the wider community have set up a child protection network to manage that. So the challenge for us is to complete that handover of our Village Hive model in its entirety to the community so that we can then exit and partner with the next community, but having real tangible actionable exit strategy for us. And I think what that sort of feeds into is a broader challenge I think that we have in this sector, which is the need to work out how we decolonize the work that we're doing, and ensure that we have the localization of projects, that the people whose lives are affected by these programs are the ones in the decision-making seats and the architects of these programs that we're implementing. So I would say that for me is the biggest challenge going forward.
Thanks, Tara. Interesting to hear there's some of the patterns. I think the intergenerational issue in that sense comes up again, similar to what Sharon was saying, which is working across the generations on some of these issues is certainly the way to lead about change. And that's, I mean, what an incredible amount of work you're doing, and what a particular context. And it just, what I like about this is that, we're talking so much about some of the bigger picture, and you're really talking about a very specific issue at a grassroots level, but it encompasses absolutely everything. It goes from the grassroots all the way up through a system change and shifting the power. And certainly it demonstrates how difficult this all is. I think we all go into these areas of work like climate change or international development because we really care about resolving these significant issues. And certainly in my own journey, I worked in developing countries for a significant amount of time, and it's just so challenging. It's hard to stay upbeat about seeing change. You see it, but it always feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and there's just always bigger and bigger issues. And so as we go through our careers, there's this challenge of looking at how do we combine some of that work. We know that the grassroots and working, again, shifting the power is a key way of doing that. But you continue to work at the grassroots level while also suddenly looking at governance and looking at working with policy and at that kind of top level, I guess, and really shifting governance and trying to add other layers of things that we can utilize to shift that conversation. So amazing work. Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing. And I'm sure that we'll have a lot of questions for you. Sam, governance is a very good lead into I think some of the things that you're dealing with these days. So I'll throw it straight at you with the same questions of things that you have chosen to challenge and been proud of, but also what we need to challenge moving forward, or where do you see those areas?
Thanks so much, Kristina, and I feel humbled coming after listening to Tara and Sharon, because that work is just profound, and they're the stories and the leadership that inspire me. I join you today from the land of the Gadigal here in Sydney, and I just wanted to also pay my respects to elders past and present, and really draw out, I guess, an acknowledgement of Indigenous and First Nations women, particularly here in Australia. And I was really attracted yesterday to some of the commentary and participation in International Women's Day by Professor Megan Davis and Pat Anderson, who we should never forget led the constitutional dialogues that led to the Uluru Statement and are out front and asking everyone, but particularly women of all backgrounds, to become very keenly public and to be advocates for constitutional reform in this country for First Nations. So I just wanted to call out those extraordinary women. Megan and Pat are just, and their contributions yesterday are worth looking at. In thinking about this, I reflected a bit on things I'm most proud of, and on that journey, I guess I just wanted to reflect particularly for this audience and the discussion we're having, that there are lots of things I think have happened in recent years that we should be really proud of. Natalie Isaacs many years ago created the 1 Million Women network, and with an ambition to get to 1 million women around the world to reduce carbon and to galvanise women across the world, including the Pacific, I hope. But I was on her board for many years, and seeing how we had to structure things to make sure that a women's movement was well funded and well governed, and still exists to this day, doing the heavy lifting work of getting women who didn't know whether they were part of the climate movement into that world, and now are. And then when I chaired ACFID, the Council for International Development, a few years ago now, there'd been a history of women chairs of ACFID, which was incredibly encouraging. But when we looked at in the sector whether women were leading as chief executives and chairs of the members of ACFID, we saw that that had dropped off. And as of 2015, it was about 23% chief executives and about 40% CEOs and 23% chairs. And we committed to actually working with the sector to grow the path for women to chair those boards of not-for-profits in the international aid sector, and so chairs and chief executives. And by 2018, that had lifted to 34% of chairs and 52% of chief executives. So I've got the balance right, that now more women lead international development organisations in this country than men, but it was purposeful, and it was set as part of a discussion with the ACFID board by looking at the data. So I think they're things they're worth thinking about in terms of women in power. And I know we've been talking about empowering women, but I kind of start, particularly this time of the year, and particularly what we're all dealing with, knowing that we are innately and inherently powerful. We are powerful people, we're powerful human beings. And what we need is to be allowed to have our power felt, and to have opportunities to actually use our power in the way that women do. And so I think about the roles that I've done, and the things I'm most proud of is disrupting the system in governance to ensure that powerful women are in positions of power, so that their words are heard, their leadership is felt, and that we actually disrupt the system. So I guess if I think of many of the things I've done, I'm proud of the fact that I'm a big supporter of quotas. I'm happy to have that conversation in the question and answer session. I've been a quota appointment on a number of occasions. I advocate for quotas for women in leadership in right across the board, the corporate sector, the not-for-profit sector, sport, the arts. So I'm wearing my arts t-shirt today to talk about the women named artists that we don't ever really reflect on when we think about the great artists of this country. But calling for quotas and then being a quota appointment proudly is something that I'm proud of. And the way to do that is something that I'm proud of, because when I have been the first woman appointed on a body, whether it was to the AFL Commission in 2005 or to corporate boards or elsewhere, my typical response is to say to the chairs who are making that appointment, can we do a deal? I would love to be your first woman on this board, but can I just absolutely not be your only and last? And can we come to some arrangement and understanding that the next set of appointments will include a woman, and that together, working with the board and the team, we are going to work towards gender parity, or at least a sort of 40-40-20 ambition for boards and for governance. And when you actually make that request and ask it of good chairs and good leaders who are making these appointments, what are they going to say? Like, I don't think they can say no, because if they say no to people who are asking to step up, women to step up, then they lose us as people of merit who should be in those roles, and then lose that pathway to gender equality in a governance sense. So I try to, whenever I am that first appointment, to then have that understanding and then move as rapidly as possible to bring women on. And in almost all those cases, that's led to almost gender equality on the board, or getting close to it, with women candidates being considered just as the men have always been considered in more equal numbers. So I think that's the thing I'm proud of at a systems level, that women like me who've got incredible privilege to actually understand how to use that, and how to ensure that that's an act of disruption in itself. And I think it's not just boards, it's getting women into positions of authority as chief executives heads of government departments, heads of NGOs. And we know the other theme for International Women's Day from the UN this year is Women Lead. And we know that without this kind of action, we're not given a chance to lead. And in the corporate world in Australia at the moment, we've actually found that COVID has encouraged a retreat on backing women into leadership positions. So, you know, some sad reversals in the corporate sector. And a lot of the men who were asked during COVID why only one of 15 chief executive appointments last year during COVID were, only one was a woman. And similarly in senior management, many of those men said, look, in times of great challenge, we go to where we feel safest and we go to the things we know. So we recruited in our own image. And so we saw a resurgence of men appointing men instead of keeping up that energy around appointments of women. So we've got to keep really clearly, I think the others have spoken about that intersectionality of health crises and climate crises. I would add what we're living through now with the gender issues and the safety of women, the appalling stories we're living through in this country around lack of respect for women that ends up in a sexual assault, harassment, or just being ignored, is part of that, is such a big part of the story of intersectionality and why all these things require right now for us to be actively seeking those leadership positions and being confident in disrupting the system. And I feel for you, Tara, when you talk about the imposter syndrome, and I'm happy to share with you and everyone on the call, we all have it. Every woman has a form of imposter syndrome and a sense of guilt or shame or concern about how we step up and who we're stepping over and how that's observed. And maybe it's the passage of time and the fact that I'm now in my mid-50s, but I now take that imposter system and turn it on its head and just say, why not? If you're asked to do the thing and you're proud of what you do, stepping up and helping to disrupt that system. So, Kristina, that's kind of the systems issue that I'm proud of, and I'll keep advocating on as loudly and as broadly as I can.
Oh, thank you, Sam. And that disruption is certainly something that, you know, how do you lead to system change? I mean, if we just keep appointing the same people that we know how they're going to behave because we want continuity, then continuity is going to lead to where we are. So how do we change that? And that is just, you know, it's at the heart of everything, isn't it? I mean, you just said it very well, Sam. It's like whether it's health or whether it's climate change, at the end of the day, we're just trying to change these significant issues, but it's how do we change it? How do we make it truly transformational? And investing in women and in girls and in education and in empowerment of females and of local, also of just local grassroots leaders. But in our context, we're talking about women today. Certainly it seems to be the great disruption in that sense, because even as you said, we're looking at the boardrooms, we're looking at the corporate world, and certainly that is not reflected. So continuing to be disruptive, and in that sense, maybe that is part of the imposter syndrome, isn't it? It's just sort of saying like, well, maybe I should be here, maybe I should, you know, I think men suffer from imposter syndrome as well. Like I have this conversation at home all the time where it's like, oh, today I felt like I was so out of my depth. And then you say, no, you weren't. You knew exactly what you're talking about. That's why you were asked to be there.
I think less men have the imposter syndrome kind we have.
Oh, definitely.
I get where you're going.
There's no question. There's no question that they have it less, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, we're reminded all the time that we don't deserve to be in these places and that we have faults, we have barriers. And if I think about what I think the future is all about and what we've got to be, what I'm really focused on now, and one of my roles that I'm really proud of is as chair of Australians Investing in Women. Changed that name during the course of COVID to make the point that we're not just a network of women supporting gender equality, but we are wanting more people in this country to invest in women, whether that's philanthropically, corporately, or otherwise. And so one of the things I think is all about the future is when we talk about investing in women, we've got to back it. We've got to back it with the money and back it with the intent. And we've got to apply a gender lens, the proper gender lens to policy and investment at all levels, and have all philanthropists, all governments actually understand what that gender lens methodology really is. It's not just giving us crumbs at the end of the budget process to say, here's a budget for you to go figure out your issues. It is actually a foundational question whenever a policy is created and when money is given. And the other thing for me for the future, which I think goes so much to Tara and Sharon's points, is when you're as lucky as I am with my kind of privilege to find myself in situations where I get to chair things. And I've chaired for many years the GO Foundation, which is a scholarship foundation for Indigenous young people created by Adam Goods and Michael O'Loughlin. They want it skewed to women and girls. They want predominantly women on the board. and they want it to be Indigenous run and Indigenous governed. And we invited a UN woman, an Indigenous UN woman, onto the board, Sonia Stewart, just a little while ago. And it was clear that our new chair had arrived on our board. And even though I had a couple of years left on the board as chair, speaking to Adam and Michael as founders, I said, I just need to get out of the way. I don't have to sit in this chair for any longer. Our chair has arrived. It's an Indigenous woman, a strong UN woman, and she should be chairing this organisation. Let's just do it, which we did. And that they asked me if I would just stay on the board and not just leave. But women like me have got to do what men have never done, which is when we've done our work and the right person is there to take over, is get out of the way. And so, I'd ask that of men too, that when there are great women arriving, just get out of the way. Don't sit in board seats and chief executive roles simply because your term hasn't finished. We owe it to this change in this moment to actually just get out of the way, and that those other powerful women particularly step in. So that's my kind of future thought, in addition to just gender equality at every level.
Yeah, I really relate to that getting out of the way as well, in that what happened to me during COVID was that I happened to be back in Australia renewing my passport when the borders closed. And we had been working towards a goal in the future, in a few years' time, of a handover to 100% local leadership. And what happened during COVID was that brought that plan all the way forward. And what we saw through 2020 and the progress that was made on the ground in handing over our village hive model to the community, and the strides that were made with the local team really just brought to light that I didn't need to wait. And that, I think the discussion around quotas, I think, is a really important one. And I think an important discussion for the international development sector is like, where are the quotas for local people on these boards? Particularly for international charities. Our board in Cambodia is now made up of, our whole leadership team is, our whole team is 100% Khmer and Cambodian, including our leadership team and including our board, who's comprised also of ex-beneficiaries, people who have the lived experience of, surviving orphanages and things, and are informing how the organisation grows and develops at the highest level of decision-making. So, what I found is basically, for me, getting out of the way has led to huge strides on the ground, because there's more space for local ideas and innovation. So,
yeah. Can I just jump onto that? Because I think it's also really important to look at the different models in terms of feminist practice in particular. So one of the things I found, just at a very personal level, was with Global Fund for Women. When I became the chair, we've actually created a co-chair position. So there's me as a feminist from the Global South, together with a colleague from the UK, but based in the US. And that balances it out, because in no way can I provide leadership on information around US philanthropic-based, issues. So I think that's really important. The other thing that we're doing through the Shifting the Power Coalition is the whole issue of feminist accompaniment. So it's not just about, yes, I respect what you're saying, Tara, in terms of the localization, but it's also about how do we also support local women around ensuring that they are also supported to be in those positions of decision making, with the necessary resources, with the necessary technical support, and so that they can be in that position. Otherwise, we're just creating those layers of burden. So, and particularly when there is that expectation that, well, women will just volunteer anyway. But, to be engaged in talking even to your local council, talking to your traditional Indigenous leaders, you need to have that process as well. So it comes back once again in terms of, yes, having the institutional frameworks, which we have. We have 25 years of the Beijing Platform for Action. We have, commitments on women in disaster preparedness. We have commitments around women in humanitarian action, including the Security Council resolution, but we don't have the resources. So unless those resources are coming in to our institutional arrangements in the way that we're organizing to support our leadership in our communities, I don't think we're going to make that change. And so that whole theme about our theme around women's leadership and choosing to challenge, we also have to have that conversation about challenging financing and where the resources are actually, one, coming from, but where are they going, and how we as women should be determining how the money is spent. Thanks.
Thanks, Sharon. And if I could just, I think it's time to throw some questions, and we've had a few good ones, but I just wanted to bring back focus on this question of investment and of the role of philanthropy. I mean, I mentioned I've gone on this journey of working in development and in climate and in policy and then being an entrepreneur. And I think philanthropy for me was the way to wed all of these issues. How do I address? I could be working with organizations, I could be sitting on boards or being a technical advisor or whatnot, but I can also really financially support organizations because they will make the best decisions for what they need to do. And Sam, you know, renaming the organization to investing, I mean, I think the use of the word investment is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because coming from working in philanthropy and in business, quite often you have philanthropists who quite often come from a business lens, and they're looking at saying, oh, don't use the word investment. You know, investment is like I'm expecting some kind of financial return. Well, no, you're not. If you're in philanthropy and you want a better world, you're actually working towards an objective where you need to look at what is the expected outcome. It's a societal change. It's a healthier planet, whatever it may be. It's a more happy community with gender roles and healthy children. That is what you're investing in. So the return on your investment is actually seeing that impact on the ground. It's not about a financial investment in that sense. And I think it's a really important conversation to have in philanthropy about the fact that we are investing in communities by supporting them to do what they see as the need of what needs to happen, rather than us continuously thinking about, well, I think I've seen this somewhere else. This is the model that works, so I'm going to support that, which brings us back to Tara's journey. I mean, I think she didn't really walk us through the whole story, and hopefully a lot of the speakers on here could see her TED talk or read more about what she's done. But she started out with the intention of doing an orphanage a certain way, and then she relatively quickly realized that that's actually not what the issue that was really needed to be addressed is, and therefore it wasn't really the solution. And she was brave enough to turn around and say, right, we're going to shift our model and actually go to where the problem on the ground is. So again, what's the outcome that we want? And that's what we should be investing in.
So just one thing I was going to say, Kristina, because I wanted to do a big shout out to Julie Riley, fellow board members at what we now have to get used to calling Australians Investing in Women, AIIW, because we got so used to AWDN, Australian Women Donors Network. But we did a lot of work last year looking at the philosophy of what do those words mean, and the words donors and a network was kind of playing to a hopeful thing that philanthropists and people who could give might give through this network. And by unpacking all of it and using those, investing in women, and that it is investment, and that there will always be a return. We know, but we keep hearing the tropes about an investment in women and in girls is always beneficial, but we want to make that point. But we also had discovered that despite the greatest aims of the greatest philanthropists, there's still a misunderstanding about the application of a gender lens in giving in philanthropy. There's lots given to women, but not at the starting point, at the top of the hill or the top of the house where the money is first distributed, thinking about how to apply a gender lens and then do that properly. So that's sort of the thinking behind it, and we're really proud we've changed that. And Julie has been a pioneer in this area with her work on that lens. And we've got to do it in policy and government and the budgets around the country as well. So yeah, thank you for noticing that. It's a big change for us.
It's a really important one. So I think we could throw it to questions now, and they lead straight into what we've just been talking about, which is perfect. But there were a couple that have come up. One was about, is there any work happening to shift the culture that sits with the perpetrators in some of the vulnerable communities and where women and children require protection? That's one question. And another one is, in light of what we've talked about, just the gender lens and policy and investment, how do we affect change in international communities where patriarchal government and cultures predominate? Now, I think I'll throw it to you because I've spoken enough, but I could think of a number of examples in Vanuatu with the rise, and certainly I would encourage people to have a look at some of those links later and read more about the work of some of these organizations. But if you three ladies, Sam, Sharon, and Tara, could maybe address those questions. I think one of them especially is a lead on straight on what you were talking about, Sam.
Oh, I was going to hand over to
okay.
Tara on that, just because I think that issue of vulnerable communities and particularly with perpetrators is a specific one. I could talk about from ANROWS data and research, but I think it's much better to go to one of the other speakers at the moment on that one, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
In regards to how the question of what was it?
So how is there any work happening to shift the culture that sits with the perpetrators? So in community, and actually that's a kind of a relevant one to your work, of course, is there work of dealing with not just shifting the culture, but also dealing with where the problem is being created?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the model that we've co-created with these communities mobilizes the whole community to respond to child protection issues, but also it's a preventative model. So it looks at early intervention, where a child protection network is formed by community members in the village, and it's their role to identify every single vulnerable child and family in their community and refer them into support from a social worker, village-based social worker in their community. And it's the role and the responsibility of the whole community then to protect children, and also looking at, you know, addressing issues that arise in families before issues become intractable. So in really investing in prevention and upstream approaches rather than the sort of downstream. I think that's a shift that needs to happen in child protection across the world, is more resources focused on addressing root causes and preventative measures rather than waiting until children are in such dangerous situations that they're falling into child protection systems, ending up in orphanages or foster care, of which the trauma has already occurred, and you know, the measures then to ameliorate those risks, it's so much harder to do. So the whole model is focused on strengthening families, ensuring they have all of the resources and supports around them so that they can raise the children, protect the children, and ensure that the children in the community are safe. So I guess the whole community-wide response and a preventative approach is sort of how we've addressed it. And of course, there are some children who are in serious child protection situations of which, you know, alternative care is required. But then if enough preventative measures are in place to prevent children from falling into the system in the first place, then the support for those children, ensuring that there are safe alternative care options for them, is just much easier to manage when the system's not overburdened.
Right.
Yeah, I would add that I really like the focus on prevention, Tara, because that's been an issue we've been talking about for quite some time here in the Pacific, both in bringing together, you know, through the work of peace building, when you need to look at the root causes, and also when you look at, you know, the whole issue around violence. We talk about elimination of violence against women and children, but if we don't look at the root causes, we're not going to address, you know, the drivers of violence and conflict. One of the challenges that we have found is also, particularly in the traditional and community settings, is unpacking what is happening in terms of violence, because, you know, the whole challenge from the 70s onwards, in particular, around violence is a private issue, to also not raising the issue in traditional settings, and how to now engage with men in the communities, with traditional leaders, and even the faith community. So we have a number of our Shifting the Power Coalition partners looking at ways of doing work in ways that they're working across, you know, gender dialogues through the intergenerational approach, but the cross-gender dialogue work, both in Fiji through Transcend Oceania and the Nazareth Center in Bougainville, is really demonstrating that the way in which women are actually looking at the nexus approach around bringing peace building practice, looking at issues because they know it gets worse during humanitarian crises, and being able to then provide strategies for the development sector that can say, look, you've got to address things this way. You've got to invest not just in the building of safe spaces, but investing in the processes that result in safe communities. And so that's very critical, because the whole approach to protection and prevention, I think, needs a lot more resourcing and a lot more focus in learning from the experiences of women.
Thank you, Sharon. I think we're very close to our end time, and I really want to hand it over to Belinda Morrissey to say a few words at the end. I just want to close on my end by saying that we won't solve the world's problems without having women in power and without doing all the work that we're doing. And I really hope that we have managed to inspire or give some ideas of doing things in a better way or in a new way for some of the people who are listening today. So thank you very much, Tara, Sam, and Sharon, and Julie and Belinda for organizing. And I will hand it over to Belinda for a few words at the end. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Well, thank you to you too, Kristina. I've known you for so many years, but I still always learn so much from you. So look, as Julie mentioned in her introduction, my name's Belinda Morrissey, and I'm very proud to be the Vice Chair of ActionAid Australia. And I'm also the CEO of the English Family Foundation, and as such, we're members of AIDN. So an enormous thanks to all of our speakers today. I learned so much, and what an inspiring conversation. Just so many challenging issues, and I really did hear the passion and the vision from all of you. So thank you very much to you all. I've taken copious amounts of notes, as I'm sure everybody online has as well. But some of the themes that really resonated with me was about that gender equality really needs to be driven by empowering women. And Sam, as you said, we are powerful, and that we need to use our voice to actually enable this empowerment of women. And I think, Kristina, you summed it up at the beginning when you said that, you know, the time for action is now. We've seen this across the last year with COVID. We've seen this in Australia with all the issues that are happening, all the challenging conversations that are happening at the moment. So thank you to you all. We need more women like you in our world. We need your vision and your spirit and your really generous and brave approach today to sharing your stories with us. So thank you. I'd also like to thank Julie and AIDN for their leadership in championing international giving at a time when the world faces just one of the largest ever global emergencies with the COVID crisis, which is really impacting women significantly. And we know that it's setting the agenda, the equality agenda back decades. So as you know, AIDN's message is to amplify the work of the international development sector. And if this has really resonated with you, then I encourage you to go onto the AIDN website and join us and become a member as well. I'd also like to thank ActionAid Australia particularly for their work in choosing to challenge the humanitarian system. And Sharon, you know, your work with the Shifting the Power Coalition, and Kristina with the ARISE Fund really demonstrates what we can achieve when we work together. You can find out sort of more around the initiatives like the ARISE Fund and the Shifting the Power Coalition on the ActionAid website. I think Julie will be sending those website links out to you all tomorrow with the follow-up, and also to Tara's website as well. But ultimately, if these conversations have affected you and touched you and particularly inspired you, and you would like to continue the conversation, please feel free to reach out to us, to Kristina and myself around ActionAid Australia, and obviously Julie around AIDN. So on behalf of you all, thank you to our speakers. On behalf of our speakers, thank you to all of you for being online. I really hope that this has inspired you into action, into choosing to challenge and realizing that the time is now. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.